Welcome back to the Offbit. Today we'll be looking at the i7-3930K placed in a cheap Chinese motherboard that we slapped in this old HP desktop case. We've married up this 3930K with the GTX 970. We'll be trying a few games and running this through its usual system paces. This PC is a bit of a junkyard bits of PC, but stick around and find out how this system runs. This here is our cheap Remake X79 motherboard from China. These boards can be easily found on eBay and AliExpress and other similar sites. These motherboards do come with a bit of a mixed reputation, so here at the Offbit we decided to give this motherboard a try and find out for ourselves just how well or how bad these cheap Chinese motherboards can be. This motherboard is from an unknown manufacturer and comes in a box that basically says motherboard. The BIOS manufacturer information in CPU-Z says to be filled by OEM. It is a mystery who makes this motherboard, but from what we do know about this motherboard is it is an X79 chipset which uses the standard LGA 2011 socket. It has two SATA 3 ports and two SATA 2 ports, comes with an M.2 port on the motherboard and has 8 USB 2 ports on the back. It uses 4 DDR3 sticks running only and highlighting only in dual channel mode, not quad channel mode, which is a real shame since this CPU does support quad channel mode on this platform. This will significantly reduce the memory bandwidth and overall it will affect the performance in games and in applications. Moving on to the CPU, this is the i7-3930K. This is a 6-core 12-threaded beast from 2011. With unlocked multipliers, this CPU really can take some overclocks, though this needs to be married with the right motherboard. The i7-3930K is a Sandy Bridge E CPU, has a base clock of 3.2 GHz and can boost up to 3.8 GHz. This CPU is loaded with 12 meg of level 3 cache and can use up to 130 watts of power. The GPU we're using today is the NVIDIA GTX 970. This version we are using is from Asus. This particular version is the Strix-GTX 970-DC2OC-4GD5. This GPU is from the NVIDIA Maxwell architecture range and has 4GB of GDDR5 RAM. This GPU can consume up to 225 watts of power. The GTX 970 supports the following APIs: DirectX 12, OpenCL 3.0, OpenGL 4.6 and Vulkan 1.2. The RAM we're using today is from a mixed bag, giving us a total of 8GB of DDR3 RAM. We're using 2 lots of 2GB sticks from G.Skill. These sticks are capable of being clocked up to 1600 MHz. We're also using 2 lots of 2GB sticks from OCZ. This RAM obviously is marketed for AMD Black Edition chips, but works fine in our setup. The OCZ RAM can also be clocked up to 1600 MHz as well. The drives we're using today are, we are using a 512GB SPP34A60 M.2 SSD drive. This is going to be used for our operating system and games. We're also using a 1TB magnetic drive from Seagate. This is a Seagate Barracuda drive. It's time to check out those benchmarks. In 7-zip, our i7-3930K single core score sat behind the 1st gen and 2nd gen CPUs, also placing a long way back from the Intel i7-6700K. The multi-core score for our i7-3930K placed 2nd to the 1st gen 6-core Xeon X5680. The 3930K CPU seems to be placing well enough for the CPU-Z test, but I think it actually should have done a lot better being a 2nd generation high-end desktop CPU. In CPU ID, our i7-3930K pushed out in front of all of the 1st and 2nd gen CPUs. For single core scores and in the multi-core score, it really pushed out in front. The i7-3930K in Cinebench also took 1st place, beating the 4-core 8-thread i7-6700K, in which it was only done by a handful of points. This really shows the strengths of the single core performance of the 6700K though. Against the 1st gen Xeon, the X5680, the i7-3930K beat it by about 100 points. This CPU is still somewhat a beast for its time. packing 6 cores and 12 threads, making a great CPU for content creation. And for its day with its unlocked cores, this CPU would certainly do well with a good overclock. Unfortunately, this motherboard here really only gives us limited overclocking options on that front. Moving on to the GTX 970. The GTX 970 in Cinebench performed pretty much averagely. Sitting up with all the other cards, nothing extremely great. I mean, it's interesting that the GTX 660 GS actually beat it, and so did a GTX 770. Now this benchmark does show the combination of the GPU and CPU working together, but always seems to favours AMD video cards. Moving along into Unity in heaven, the GTX 970 pushed out way in front of the GTX 770s and the 660s, and left the GTX 570 well behind in its dust. Though it's worth noting that the GTX 570 was paired with a much slower CPU. Finally, our final 3D benchmark test for the day is 3D Mark's Firestrike. Our GTX 970 pushed out well in front once again, which almost doubled the performance of the GTX 770 paired with the Phenom 2 955 Black Edition, or even the overclocked Xeon E5430. Now the GTX 970 is not the fastest card out there, and that's by a long shot these days as well. But in my books, this card is still very much relevant to play newer games. First up, we tried our hand at Sea of Thieves. Sea of Thieves did sport quite well for this particular setup, giving us smooth gameplay with only little low lag when loading in the islands. We played Sea of Thieves at 1920 by 1080 with medium details set. The frame rates for Sea of Thieves. Average frame rate was 100.9 frames per second, our minimum frame rate hit 53.1 frames per second. Maximum frame rates hit 141.9 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows was a nice 17.5 frames per second. As we said, this was very much an enjoyable gaming experience, giving us nothing but smooth and pretty much uninterrupted gameplay. Sea of Thieves with our setup did show a good amount of breathing space for our graphics settings. This setup should be able to take higher detail settings without affecting the gameplay for those who like to see more pretties. Jumping into Red Dead Redemption 2. We played Red Dead Redemption 2 with a resolution of 1600 by 900 with low detail settings. With Red Dead, we did notice the system began to show some struggles with the frame rates, but yet still it could deliver what we would call an enjoyable gameplay. Frame rates for Red Dead Redemption 2 with average frame rate of 38.0 frames per second, our minimum frame rates hit 31.5 frames per second. The maximum frame rates hit 52.7 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows hit 10.1 frames per second. Now as the stats show, this game did play quite fine, but just not perfect, showing that our GPU would more likely be the bottleneck more so than our CPU. This game is very pretty, even with low details, and yes, we could say this game would run okay on this setup, but be warned, you'll need to come to some compromises just for something playable, and you'll never get anything just exactly perfect. Moving on, we tried Call of Duty Warzone. We ran this game with a resolution of 1920 by 1080 at low settings. In general, we found this game to run pretty good, with only a few minor issues here and there with load lag. The frame rates for Call of Duty Warzone were average frame rates of 74.3 frames per second, a minimum frame rate as low as 22.6 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate hit a whopping 120.4 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows was at 1.6 frames per second. As discussed, generally this game ran quite well. My only real issue with this game was my inability to do well. So, apologies on my behalf there. However, we can give this game a thumbs up for this setup. Going back into an older classic game, we've got PUBG. PUBG ran pretty much perfect on our settings, though we did not have these set very high. We ran PUBG at 1920 by 1080 with low settings. This setup did deliver silky smooth gameplay, which really is what you need for competitive online first-person shooter games in my thoughts. Our frame rates for PUBG were with an average frame rate of 98.7 frames per second. Our minimum frame rates hit as low as 65.3 frames per second, which is actually pretty good. Our maximum frame rate hit a whopping 143.5 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows hit a frame rate of 26.4 frames per second. These stats just concreting just how well this system ran PUBG, which was pretty much perfect. The final game we tried today on our system was Valheim. We found Valheim to run fairly well, though not perfect. We did run this game at low settings with a resolution of 1920 by 1080. Generally, we found this game to deliver a very playable experience, with only seeing some issues here and there. It is also worth noting that this system was not able to keep a stable 60 FPS, spending most of its time in the 40 to 50 frames per second ranges. The frame rates for Valheim were average frame rate of 50.6 frames per second, our minimum frame rates hit 20.5 frames per second, our maximum frame rate hit 79.8 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows hit a low 3.9 frames per second. As we discussed, this game for us runs okay. Not great, but good enough to find yourself enjoying this game. Though do keep in mind, if there is a big boss fight or there's something where there's a lot going on, your expected performance may vary. Wrapping this system up, the motherboard in this system is cheap. Yes, it does the job and it does it okay, but that's where it stays. If you're planning to overclock this motherboard, then this is not an option for you. Yes, this motherboard did support the unlock multiplier from our K-series i7 CPU, but it did not really let us overclock the multiplier far before this system crashed. There's also no base clock overclocking. To be honest, the 3930K would probably be much better in a different motherboard. Though we had this 3930K spare sitting around doing nothing, and it was better in a system than not, so we gave this motherboard a try. We did find a few other problems with this motherboard, such as there was no way to change the voltages on the RAM or the CPU. RAM overclocking did not work, and our front panel audio did not work either. We did get an odd crash after Windows updates on shutdown. Basically, it just wouldn't turn the PC off after it was done with the update. Now, let's talk about the 3930K. In my thoughts, this is still not a bad CPU. With its unlocked cores and 12 threads, it really has some potential if it's mixed with the right motherboard. Specifically, a motherboard that supports overclocking quite well. If you are able to overclock this CPU to over 4 GHz, its ability to run games, especially newer titles, would just be a lot better. But alas, with this motherboard, you will struggle to do that. Now, the GTX 970. Yes, this card is dating a bit, and I would consider it not as a new video card anymore. This card still has the ability to play most of the new AAA titles. Well, if you're willing to drop resolutions and have a bit of compromise with those graphic details. And in my opinion, with the state that the global economy of graphics cards are at this current time, this card is probably not a bad idea as a see-me-through card. Especially until the price gouging and the video card shortage is over. Once again, we have finished another video for the Offbit. Thank you for watching us and thank you for supporting us. Now, if you like this video, please hit that like button. If you'd like to see more videos from us at the Offbit here, please hit that subscribe button. And don't forget, there is a notifications button as well. And please always feel free to leave us a comment on our videos. Thank you once again for sticking around and watching a video with us at the Offbit. And we'll catch you guys next time on the Offbit.